Okay, good morning, Year 8. So I'm going to be giving you a short video introduction to one of your last lessons on the Reformation today. Um, and today we're going to be looking at why Luther's powerful German patrons protected him. So if you could just make sure, if you don't have so already, some line paper or your exercise book, and very quickly, I'd like to get that title down into your books. And then I'd like to have a quick look at this painting, and I want you just to have a guess about what kind of man do you think this person is and why. So look at some of the things he's wearing, how he's standing. So just bullet point a couple of ideas you've got about what kind of man you think he might be. And then a challenge question. Why might this person have been a useful ally for Luther against the church once he began his protest? Okay, so I'll just pause there for a second and make sure you've got those two down, please. Okay, so you should have your title down and you should have had a go at that starter and the challenge as well. Okay, so some ideas you might have picked out. You might have said, well, maybe he's some sort of king because of the kind of like gown he's wearing. Some of you might have said, well, maybe he's a sort of warrior because you notice that he's got this big sword. Some of you might have thought he was someone powerful or important because of just the way he's standing. He's got that kind of stance, which makes him look like a sort of powerful, important individual. Challenge, lots of things you could have said for that. The fact that he's got a sword, so he's probably going to be quite useful as a protector. The fact that he was someone who was rich and powerful would probably also make him someone who would be a useful ally to Luther, using his connections and influence to protect him. Now, this person here is actually a famous German noble called Frederick the Wise, who was the prince of an area of Germany called Saxony. And he was really important to Luther's success because he protected him at the point when the church declared him a heretic and tried to have him killed. He then sort of hid Luther for years in his castles across Germany while Luther completed his work translating the Bible into German and writing his other attacks on the Catholic Church. So what we've kind of looked at in these last few lessons is there's three big reasons why Luther's Reformation was successful. Okay, the first one was his actual ideas. Okay, so we looked at his ideas about salvation by faith alone, the idea that you didn't need the church, a priesthood of all believers. So his ideas themselves were actually very popular and interesting. But we also saw that his ideas wouldn't have mattered if he didn't have a new technology to spread them, which is the printing press, which is what we looked at last lesson. Now, the third and final cause we're going to be looking at is the role of Luther's powerful protectors, okay? So, we're going to be thinking about why so many of the German nobles protected Luther. We're going to particularly focus on some of the ways that Frederick the Wise helped him. And then finally, we're going to evaluate, weigh up, how important Luther's German patrons were to his success. So how important were people like Frederick the Wise compared to, say, the printing press or Luther's ideas themselves? All right, now one key word I want to remind you of is our title for today is why did his powerful patrons protect him, okay? Now, patron goes back to the word patronage, which we've looked at quite a few times this year. And remember, a patronage is when a person gives money or other support to a person or cause. So patronage is like the verb, okay? So to do patronage is to give someone money or support because you believe in what they're doing. So if you give patronage, you are a patron, okay? So, for example, the Abbasids were known for their patronage of leading scientists in the Islamic Golden Age, and we saw that Caliph al-Ma'mun was one of al-Khwarizmi's leading patrons because he was the one who gave out the money to support Arabic science in the Islamic Golden Age, okay? So patron is just someone who gives patronage, gives support, money, etc. to a cause they believe in. And we've seen that idea a few times. We've looked at the idea of Caliph al-Ma'mun being a patron and giving support to people like al-Khwarizmi. We also looked at, when we looked at the Renaissance, at the idea of like the Medici family being patrons to artists like Leonardo da Vinci, and likewise the Sforza family also being patrons. So Frederick the Wise is the patron of Luther and his ideas. Now, another key word for today is the idea of the nobility, okay? So the definition of nobility, and you can write this down if you want to, but you don't have to. You can pause the video here if you want to do that. The definition of nobility is the nobility of a society are all the people who have titles and belong to a high social class. So in medieval, early modern Europe, they were the aristocracy, basically the landowners, okay? but they're like the top landowners, the ones who actually have titles like Earl and Count, that make them a part of the upper aristocracy. Now, if we're using it in a sentence, sections of the German nobility were some of Luther's more important supporters. So the point was that Luther had support from lots of ordinary Germans from the bottom up, but he also had the support of a lot of these leading nobles as well, and that was very important to his success. Now the question was, what was it about Germany then that made it a good place for Luther to emerge? Some historians have said that if Luther had been born in France or in Britain, because of the way those countries were structured, it's less likely that his ideas would have become as popular with the nobility. Now, the reason for that was that Germany in those days is not like Germany was today. It wasn't a unified country. It was something called the Holy Roman Empire, which was basically all these areas were German speaking, but they were not part of like a single country. They were part of this empire called the Holy Roman Empire. But in practice, it was really broken up into lots of mini regions, okay? And particularly there were 9 really important ones, okay? One of which was Saxony, which is where Luther was from and where Frederick the Wise was the leader. But the point was that a bit like in Italy during the Renaissance, it wasn't a unified country. And just like in Italy with the city-states, the Holy Roman Empire was divided up into all these different regions which had different princes. So Frederick was the Prince of Saxony. Bavaria had a Catholic leader called Munster. So each of the regions had a different prince. And the point was that when the Reformation started, some of these princes supported Luther and others opposed him. But because the local leaders had most of the power, those who wanted to protect Luther could do, because they were almost like running their own little mini country, and they could stop the other German regions interfering. So when Luther began his attacks on the Catholic Church, Frederick decided to protect Luther in Saxony from the Catholic Church. If he'd been born in France or England, it's quite likely that the Pope would have said to the King of France or England, who at that time were Catholic, hand this guy over, and they would have said yes, because they were Catholic leaders and they would have supported the Pope. But because in Germany it was broken up into these different regions, the fact that Luther could go to a region where there was a leader who supported him was a massive advantage to him. So that's why some historians think that the Holy Roman Empire was the right place and the right time. Now, the other reason, besides it being divided up into all these different areas with different leaders that made it important, was lots of the German nobles were angry with the church and they wanted to support Luther in his campaign against the Catholic Church. Now, one reason for that was that we saw before, didn't we, that one way the Catholic Church raised money was through indulgences, okay, by charging people and saying, if you've sinned, if you pay the church donations, we can basically forgive you of your sins. But the point was that all of that money the church raised through indulgences wasn't spent on the church in Germany. It was going across the Alps over into Italy and was being used to pay for beautiful paintings like in the Sistine Chapel, Michelangelo's painting on the ceiling, which is one of the things that when Luther visited Rome, he was appalled by. He hated seeing the money that the church raised in Germany being spent on what he saw as these decadent luxuries, because he obviously thought churches should be quite simple and not be really expensive ornamental things. So they were really unhappy that lots of money was draining away from Germany into Italy to pay for what they saw as decadent luxury. So when Luther came along and said, well, actually, indulgences on the Bible, they're not legitimate. This is just the church cheating people out of money. They were really angry because they obviously didn't want that money to be going across to Italy. They wanted it to be staying within their own territory, within Germany, and building up the church there. And also, they wanted some of that money for themselves. They knew that all that money that was currently going over into Italy could quite easily be going to the nobles themselves. So that's your first big reason. They're not happy about all the money that's going over into Italy. Now, another big reason why they're angry with the church, the German nobles, is just a sense of German pride, okay? The church, although it was the Catholic Church controlled most of Europe at that time, there had been very, very few popes who were not Italians, okay? The church was very much dominated by Italians, and the Germans were not happy with the fact that they felt like they were very devoted Catholics, but they had very little say in who got to lead the church because there were no German popes up to that point. They also were unhappy that they had no say in appointing the local bishops. Okay, so the local people who actually ran the church in Germany, that was decided by the Pope in Italy. So some of it was about a sense of German pride, right? They wanted the German church to be run by Germans, and they wanted a bigger say in how the church in Rome was run, which they didn't get. So then when Luther came along and promised to create a new sort of church, they kind of jumped at the opportunity. And that's why you have lots of propaganda here supporting Luther in his cause. Okay. Now, the only thing that you need to do now, guys, is there's a second video clip, which is 6 minutes long, which is just going to summarize why Frederick the Wise helped Luther and some of the specific ways that he did that. So make sure you watch that. That's task 2, to make sure to watch that video. Okay. Now, after you've done that, you're going to get a set of cards that look like this, which will be set in as an assignment on Teams. Okay. Now, what you've got here is some of these are why the nobles were angry with the church, and some of them are examples of some of the practical ways that Frederick the Wise protected Luther. Just have a quick read through them, and then you can either colour code them or label them, do whatever you want to do to work out which is which. So, for example, for this first one, we've got Frederick gave money to help Luther study at the University of Wittenberg in Saxony while he developed his new ideas. So that first one is obviously going to be an example of how Frederick protected Luther. It's not a reason why the nobles are angry with the church. It's an example of something Frederick did to protect Luther. Okay, he gave him money to support him while he was developing his new ideas and he was studying at university. The second one here, the German nobles were angry so much money was being sucked out of Germany into Italy by indulgences and other church payments. So that one is clearly an example of the first one, why the nobles were angry with the church. So when you finish all of that, you might want to colour code them like this. Okay, so we're working out which is which. You might want to do one colour in one, another colour in the other one. You've then just got 4 quick comprehension questions to answer. And then there's a challenge one, which is going to get you to think about which of the causes you've looked at so far is more important to Luther's success. So do you think the printing press was more important than the support Luther received from German nobles like Frederick? Think carefully about that one, okay? Think about, for that challenge question, right, if the German nobles like Frederick hadn't been there, how might that have changed the history? But then also think about, if the printing press had never been able to come into existence, how might that have changed the history? Think about which of those two things you see as more important to Luther's success, okay? All right, have a lovely lesson, Year 8, and next week will be our last one, where we're going to be bringing all of this together and debating the most important reason why Luther's Reformation was successful.